Hi, everyone. Welcome back to episode 2 of the People's Perspective on Development with your host, myself, Tunisia Castle. Today, we're going to unpack what does public space look like. Firstly, just to recap, we spoke about what public space is, what public life is, and what is their relationship, how do they work together, and we brought it back to the South African context in episode 1 on how do we reclaim public space for the people again. As we go through today's episode, I want us to draw inspiration from a really inspiring and a helpful tool guide, not just a great read. And we're going to unpack the book by Angel about how to study public life. And then we're going to draw some tools and create our own public life toolbox. And then we're going to relate it back to the planning toolbox itself. And that's where we take into consideration town planning, the people's perspective on development, on how do we create improved, people centered public spaces. Firstly, this is where we're going to draw inspiration from, and we're going to use as a toolbox on how to study public life. The book provides a good framework for understanding how people use public spaces, and that is where we drew our inspiration for what is public life, what is public space, and how are they defined. It also covers a range of topics of how to observe people in space, how to collect data, how to analyze the data that is collected, and also many case studies for successful implementation of this toolbox. What is the overarching theme? If for those of you who haven't read the book is about how to study the interaction between public life and public space. Very keyword, interaction between the two. How do we study the link between human behavior and the design that the built environment puts forth for public spaces? More than that, it's about studying city life. How do we reclaim the city as people and not just see the city as a space where we work and we go back to our homes? Very important. How do we reclaim the in between spaces that we travel within, we walk, we shop? How do we engage? How do we find entertainment and peace and interaction within these common public spaces? The method was to study existing city infrastructure, existing neighborhoods, existing communities, and gain knowledge about how those people are using the space and not how we think that they should use the space, which is very, very important. We need to consider the fact that development and planning, government itself, all the various role players and stakeholders are here to serve the people, ensure quality public space and service infrastructure that preserve a sense of community and sense of safety and interaction between the public. Mobility is made easier in terms of transport and their access from public spaces to these transport options. More than that, how much of the design, preparation, and planning is guided by communities who will live and exist within the space. This is very important for development of public space, is the involvement of communities. Are we designing spaces that serve the needs for what people really want to use the spaces for? This is the public life toolbox, which we have gathered from the book itself. What's very important about it is that there are 8 tools: manners, methods that can be used to study public space, to interpret public space, and understand public life from different perspectives. Firstly, we have counting, which is measurements that allow for comparison, that allow for different regions, locations, areas. How far do people travel? Um, how long do people travel for? Are just some of the examples. We have mapping, which represents activities and people and places, and where are they located? How can we plot and draw a visual representation of people in their space? Next, we have tracing, which is where we follow the footsteps of people in between the spaces, people in public space, people to and from work, people in between the space. Tracking, this is where we take note of the movement of people over time, over a set time, and it gives an idea of people's routines. It gives an idea of people's way of life on a daily basis. Where do they travel most? Where do they spend most of their time? What is a key priority for them in their days, whether it's collecting kids from school to extramural activities? The next set of tools is very important for visualization, for interaction with your data, and not only looking at data from a planning point of view, but as a person using the space on a daily basis. Looking for traces. What is left behind? When we design walkways, where are the footprints going? What is left behind? Photography is essential for public life studies as it gives an idea of a visual representation of a moment in time where people interact with their space. Keeping a diary, register details and nuances about the interaction between public life and space, and an informal sense of intuition shared in the words of a diary. And lastly, test walks, where you yourself walk and observe and engage as the public would, as the subject would. These are very important tools, and I want for you to take note. I would like for you to keep a record of them because in episode 3, we're going to be discussing these tools in further detail with an actual planning professional who works in the space and how do they utilize it to design public spaces for communities from a professional point of view. Now we're going to bring it back to the planning toolbox. For those of us that are in development and are in the planning practice, what are the key components that we will draw from the planning toolbox to study public life? For the purposes of this episode and the episodes to come, we're going to focus on 4 tools. Firstly, the subject. Who is public space for? Secondly, we're going to look at the context. What are the perceptions that public space evokes? What are the experiences? What is taking place currently in public space? Thirdly, we're going to look at the data. Is the studies used to achieve the objectives set out by planning professionals, developers, municipal officials being achieved? Are we using the data effectively? And lastly, representation. Representation is very important because are the needs of the people we are planning and designing for being attended to? Is it being reflected in the design of public space, in the design of parks, libraries, community halls, social facilities, schools, public spaces, public institutions, heritage spaces? Does it represent our community? Does it represent South African culture? Does it represent various races in our country? Does it represent the various income groups? These are key planning tools which I hope that you keep under your pillow with you as we go into episode 3. I need you to remember it as we unpack the case studies. More than that, guys, thank you so much for joining. I cannot wait to hear the people's perspective on today's episode. Please leave your comments below, and I'll see you for episode 3.